Imagine training with discipline, pushing iron week after week, feeling the burn, chasing fatigue, and yet your body responds with silence. No visible growth, no meaningful change. It feels almost personal, as if your muscles are refusing to listen. But the body is never disobedient. It is precise. When growth does not happen, it is not because effort is missing, but because one fundamental signal is being misunderstood. Most people step into the gym carrying a quiet assumption that effort itself is the engine of growth, that the moment of strain is the moment muscle is built, that the shaking arms and burning legs are the physical evidence of progress being forged in real time. This belief feels intuitive because effort is visible and measurable, while recovery is silent and invisible. Yet biology does not reward what feels intense. It rewards what restores balance and increases survival capacity. When you lift a weight, you are not building muscle at all. You are creating disruption, tiny controlled injuries within muscle fibers that signal danger rather than improvement. And the body interprets this not as a request for size, but as a threat that must be managed carefully. From a biological standpoint, training is a message written in stress, and recovery is the moment when the body decides how to respond to that message based on resources, time, and safety it perceives. Inside the muscle, resistance training creates microscopic damage to the contractile proteins, disturbing the structural order that allows force to be produced efficiently. This damage alone does nothing positive. It is simply information, a signal that current tissue capacity was insufficient for the imposed demand. The body now faces a choice shaped by evolution. Either repair the damage back to its previous state or overcompensate by reinforcing the tissue, so the same stress will be less threatening in the future. That second option, what we call muscle growth, only occurs when the body senses that it can afford the extra energy cost. Muscle tissue is metabolically expensive. It consumes calories even at rest, and from a survival perspective, unnecessary mass is a liability during scarcity. This is why the body will never grow muscle simply because you want it to. It grows muscle only when conditions signal that strength is repeatedly required and resources are stable. Recovery is the environment in which this decision is made. During rest, complex molecular processes begin to unfold. Inflammatory responses clear damaged proteins. Satellite cells become active. Protein synthesis increases, and hormonal signals shift toward repair rather than defense. Sleep deepens this process, lowering cortisol, increasing growth hormone release, and allowing the nervous system to exit at heightened alert state. Without sufficient recovery, these processes remain incomplete, leaving muscle fibers repaired just enough to survive, but not enough to grow. In this state, training sessions accumulate fatigue rather than adaptation, and progress stalls despite increasing effort. Many people unknowingly interrupt this biological conversation by compressing rest in the pursuit of frequency or intensity. They believe more sessions equal more growth, not realizing that each workout withdraws from a recovery account that must be repaid with time, sleep, and nutrition. When withdrawals exceed deposits, the body enters protective mode, prioritizing essential functions over optional ones like hypertrophy. This is not failure. It is intelligent resource management. The body senses ongoing stress without resolution and responds by becoming more efficient, not larger. Muscles learn to recruit fibers more effectively. Movements feel smoother. But size does not increase because the environment does not feel safe enough to justify structural expansion. There is also a neurological dimension often overlooked. Resistance training stresses not only muscle tissue, but the central nervous system, which coordinates force production and movement patterns. Recovery allows neural pathways to recalibrate, reducing unnecessary tension and improving coordination. When this system remains fatigued, muscle activation becomes less precise, limiting the quality of stimulus delivered during subsequent workouts. This means even when you train hard, the signal sent to muscle is blurred, and adaptation becomes inconsistent. True growth requires clarity of signal followed by quiet time for interpretation. From a philosophical perspective, this mistake reflects a deeper human tendency to value action over patience, effort over restraint. We trust what we can feel, and discomfort feels like proof of work, while rest feels passive, almost undeserved. Yet in biological systems, creation often happens in stillness. Bones remodel during rest, memories consolidate during sleep, And muscles grow when the body is no longer fighting the stress that triggered change. Ignoring this rhythm is like planting seeds and then constantly digging them up to check if they are growing. Understanding that muscle growth is a recovery-driven process changes how training is perceived. The gym becomes a place where questions are asked, not answers delivered. Each set, each repetition is a carefully worded message to the body about what is required for future survival. Recovery is where the body drafts its reply, deciding whether to simply patch the damage or invest in stronger tissue. When recovery is respected, that reply becomes generous and adaptive. When it is rushed, the reply becomes conservative and minimal. This perspective also fosters compassion toward the body rather than frustration with it. Lack of growth is no longer seen as stubbornness or genetic limitation, but as feedback about unmet recovery needs. Fatigue, plateau, and stagnation become signals to listen rather than obstacles to overpower. When rest, sleep, and nourishment are aligned with training stress, muscle growth emerges not as a forced outcome, but as a natural consequence of biological cooperation. Ultimately, the mistake is not training too little or wanting too much. It is misunderstanding where change actually happens. Muscles do not grow in moments of struggle. They grow in moments of restoration, when the body feels secure enough to rebuild itself stronger than before. Recognizing this shifts the entire relationship with training, replacing constant urgency with deliberate intention, and transforming effort into a partnership with the body rather than a battle against it. When recovery is neglected, the body does not simply pause progress. It actively shifts its internal priorities in ways that are subtle but profound. Beneath the surface of visible movement and effort, the nervous system is constantly evaluating whether the environment is safe or demanding, predictable or chaotic. Every intense training session is interpreted as a form of stress, and without sufficient recovery, that stress never resolves. Instead of returning to baseline, the system remains slightly elevated, like an alarm that never fully turns off. In this state, the body is not preparing to build, it is preparing to endure. From a physiological standpoint, chronic incomplete recovery alters hormonal balance in a direction that discourages growth. Stress hormones remain elevated, particularly cortisol, which plays a necessary role in mobilizing energy during training, but becomes counterproductive when it stays high for extended periods. Cortisol promotes the breakdown of tissue to maintain blood glucose and support immediate survival needs. When the body perceives constant demand without adequate rest, it interprets muscle tissue not as an asset, but as a reserve that can be broken down if needed. This does not mean muscles visibly shrink overnight, but it does mean that the internal environment becomes hostile to hypertrophy, favoring maintenance at best. At the same time, anabolic signaling becomes muted. The hormonal and cellular messengers responsible for repair and growth are highly sensitive to context. Growth hormone release, for example, is closely tied to deep sleep and parasympathetic nervous system dominance, both of which are compromised when recovery is insufficient. Testosterone, insulin sensitivity, and local muscle growth factors all respond to perception of balance and stability. When the body senses ongoing strain, it does not amplify these signals, it dampens them, conserving resources for more essential processes like immune function and neural regulation. This shift is not a flaw. It is an evolutionary safeguard. In a natural environment, prolonged stress without recovery often meant danger, scarcity, or migration. Under those conditions, building additional muscle mass would be inefficient and risky. Muscle requires fuel, oxygen, and maintenance. A stressed organism that chooses growth over vigilance would be less likely to survive. The modern gym recreates intense physical demands without the natural recovery rhythms that once followed them. When those rhythms are ignored, the body responds exactly as it was designed to, by prioritizing resilience over expansion. The nervous system plays a central role in this decision-making process. Training stimulates the sympathetic branch, increasing alertness, heart rate, and muscular readiness. Recovery requires a shift toward the parasympathetic state, where digestion, repair, and regeneration dominate. When training sessions are stacked too closely together or combined with poor sleep and mental stress, this shift never fully occurs. The body remains biased toward readiness rather than repair. In this state, muscles may still function, but they are not invited to change structurally. Over time, this imbalance subtly reshapes how the body uses energy. Calories that might have supported muscle repair are diverted toward managing inflammation, stabilizing blood sugar, and supporting brain function under stress. This is why some individuals train intensely and eat adequately yet fail to grow. The issue is not intake, but allocation. The body is spending energy on survival tasks, not construction projects. Muscle growth is always optional from a biological perspective, and optional processes are the first to be reduced when resources feel limited. Psychologically, this state often creates a feedback loop. Lack of visible progress leads to increased training intensity or frequency in an attempt to force adaptation. This further elevates stress and deepens a recovery deficit. The individual feels busy, committed, and exhausted, yet stuck. The body, meanwhile, interprets this escalation as confirmation that conditions are unstable. It responds by becoming more efficient at managing stress rather than increasing size. Strength may plateau or even increase slightly through neural adaptation, masking the underlying issue and reinforcing the belief that more effort is the solution. Sleep disruption is one of the most damaging contributors to this cycle. Even minor reductions in sleep quality can significantly impair recovery by fragmenting hormonal release and nervous system recalibration. During deep sleep, the brain coordinates tissue repair, immune regulation, and metabolic cleanup. When sleep is shortened or shallow, these processes are rushed or incomplete. The next training session begins on an already compromised foundation. Over time, the body adapts by lowering expectations, repairing just enough to function, not enough to grow. There's also an inflammatory component that quietly undermines progress. Training-induced inflammation is a normal and necessary part of adaptation, but without sufficient recovery, inflammation becomes chronic rather than cyclical. Chronic low-grade inflammation interferes with insulin signaling and protein synthesis, creating a biochemical environment where muscle-building signals are constantly interrupted. The body is not broken in this state. It is overwhelmed. It is trying to resolve unfinished repair while new damage keeps arriving. Understanding this dynamic reframes recovery as an active biological requirement rather than passive rest. Recovery is a period when the body evaluates whether recent stress was meaningful and whether it should adapt structurally. Without it, training becomes noise rather than instruction. Muscles do not respond to noise with growth. They respond to clear, resolved challenges followed by safety and replenishment. On a deeper level, this mistake reflects a cultural misunderstanding of progress, equating constant output with improvement. Biological systems operate on cycles, not straight lines. Stress and recovery are complementary forces, not opposing ones. When one dominates without the other, adaptation stalls. Recognizing this restores respect for the body's internal logic and removes the false urgency that often sabotages long-term development. When recovery is finally honored, the shift can feel almost anticlimactic. Workouts may feel less frantic, rest days less guilt-inducing. Yet beneath that calm surface, the body begins to reallocate resources. Hormonal balance improves, neural tension eases, inflammation resolves, and muscle tissue receives a clear message that it is safe to rebuild stronger than before. Growth resumes not because effort increased, but because the environment finally allowed the body to choose construction over protection. Nutrition is often discussed as numbers, grams, and totals, but the body does not experience food as arithmetic. It experiences nutrition as signals over time, patterns that communicate whether the environment is reliable or uncertain. Many people believe they are eating enough to support muscle growth because they occasionally meet calorie targets or consume high-protein meals. Yet growth remains absent because the deeper biological requirement is not abundance in isolated moments, but consistency across days and weeks. Muscle tissue responds not to sporadic surplus, but to predictable nourishment that reassures the body it can safely invest in building and maintaining additional mass. From an evolutionary perspective, irregular access to food signaled risk. In such conditions, the body learned to prioritize efficiency and storage rather than growth. Even when food appears in large amounts intermittently, the system remains cautious, interpreting inconsistency as instability. This is why irregular eating patterns, long gaps between meals, or frequent cycles of restriction and compensation quietly undermine hypertrophy. The body adapts by becoming conservative, repairing muscle fibers only to baseline levels while diverting excess energy toward fat storage or immediate use, rather than committing to long-term structural change. At the cellular level, muscle growth depends on repeated activation of protein synthesis pathways. These pathways are sensitive not only to the presence of amino acids, but to their regular availability. When protein intake fluctuates widely, muscle cells struggle to maintain the machinery required for continuous repair and growth. Protein synthesis becomes episodic rather than sustained, leading to incomplete adaptation. Even high-quality training signals can be muted when the nutritional environment fails to reinforce them consistently. Timing plays a subtle but powerful role in this process. After training, muscles are particularly receptive to nutrients as they begin repair processes. However, this window is not a narrow opportunity that closes dramatically. Rather, it is part of a broader rhythm in which the body expects nourishment to follow stress. When training is repeatedly separated from adequate post-exercise nutrition, the body learns that stress is not reliably resolved by resource availability. Over time, it adjusts by reducing the scale of its response, repairing damage efficiently but without excess growth. Consistency also affects hormonal regulation. Stable eating patterns support balanced insulin signaling, which plays a crucial role in nutrient delivery to muscle cells. Erratic intake disrupts this balance, leading to periods of inefficient nutrient uptake, followed by compensatory spikes. These fluctuations create a metabolic environment that favors short-term energy management over long-term tissue construction. Muscle growth thrives in metabolic calm, not in repeated cycles of scarcity and excess. Hydration and micronutrient intake further illustrate this principle. While often overshadowed by macronutrients, vitamins and minerals act as cofactors in countless enzymatic reactions involved in muscle repair. Inconsistent diets frequently lead to subtle deficiencies that do not cause immediate symptoms, but gradually impair recovery and adaptation. The body compensates by slowing processes that are not immediately essential, including hypertrophy. This slowdown is rarely noticeable in the short term, but over weeks and months it becomes a significant barrier to progress. There is also a psychological dimension to inconsistent nutrition that feeds back into physiology. Irregular eating patterns often accompany mental stress around food, guilt, or rigid control. This stress influences hormonal balance, increasing cortisol and sympathetic nervous system activity. Even when calorie intake appears sufficient on paper, the internal environment remains biased toward caution rather than growth. The body responds not just to nutrients, but to the overall context in which they are consumed. Many individuals unknowingly sabotage muscle growth by treating nutrition as a reactive behavior rather than a foundational routine. They eat more only on training days or after particularly hard sessions, assuming this will compensate for deficits elsewhere. The body, however, evaluates patterns over time, not individual efforts. A single well-fed day cannot override a week of inconsistency. Muscle tissue requires ongoing reinforcement that the environment is supportive, not sporadically generous. This understanding reframes nutrition as a form of communication rather than control. Each meal is a signal that resources are available and dependable. When these signals arrive regularly, the body gradually relaxes its protective stance. Protein synthesis becomes more efficient, recovery accelerates, and the threshold for adaptive growth lowers. Muscle growth then emerges as a logical response to a stable environment rather than a forced outcome. Even total calorie intake can be misleading when viewed without context. Two individuals consuming the same number of calories may experience very different results depending on how those calories are distributed across time. Regular meals support steady blood glucose levels and reduce metabolic stress, creating favorable conditions for anabolic processes. In contrast, irregular patterns force the body into frequent adjustments, diverting energy toward regulation rather than construction. Over time, consistent nutrition reshapes the body's expectations. The nervous system becomes less vigilant, hormonal rhythms stabilize, and muscle tissue becomes more responsive to training stimuli. Growth does not suddenly accelerate. It quietly resumes as the body recognizes that the cost of maintaining additional muscle is no longer a risk. What once felt like stubborn resistance reveals itself as simple biological caution, patiently waiting for reliable signals before committing to change. Many people enter training with the belief that the most exhausted version of themselves is the most effective one. That soreness, breathlessness, and complete depletion are proof that something meaningful has happened. This mindset equates fatigue with progress, yet the body does not adapt to exhaustion. It adapts to specific, repeated demands. Muscle growth is not a reward for suffering. It is a targeted response to clearly defined mechanical tension applied in a consistent pattern. When workouts are driven by the desire to feel destroyed rather than to deliver a precise stimulus, the signal sent to the body becomes confused and diluted. Muscle tissue responds primarily to tension, not chaos. Tension tells a muscle exactly how much force it must be able to produce and over what range of motion. When exercises are performed with intention, control, and repeatability, the muscle fibers experience a clear message. This specific demand is recurring and must be accommodated. In contrast, constantly changing exercises, rep schemes, and intensities in the pursuit of novelty or extreme fatigue may feel challenging, but they provide no stable reference point for adaptation. The body becomes skilled at managing stress, not at increasing size. Excessive fatigue also interferes with motor control. As exhaustion accumulates, movement quality deteriorates. Compensatory patterns emerge, shifting load away from the intended muscle groups and onto joints or secondary muscles. What feels like intense work may actually be inefficient stimulus. Over time, the nervous system learns these compensations, further reducing the effective tension placed on the target muscles. Growth stalls not because effort is lacking, but because the intended tissues are no longer receiving a clear or sufficient signal. There is also a metabolic cost to constant exhaustion. High fatigue levels increase systemic stress, elevating cortisol and inflammatory markers. While short-term fatigue is a normal part of training, chronic exhaustion shifts the internal environment toward defense rather than adaptation. Energy that could support muscle repair is instead used to restore basic function and manage inflammation. The body becomes focused on recovery to baseline, not progression beyond it. From a learning perspective, muscles and nerves adapt best to repeatable challenges. Just as the brain learns skills through repetition, muscle tissue learns demands through consistent loading patterns. Randomized high-fatigue training disrupts this learning process. The body cannot identify what it is supposed to improve because the stimulus constantly changes. This leads to generalized conditioning rather than specific hypertrophy. Strength endurance may improve, but muscle size remains unchanged because no single demand persists long enough to justify structural expansion. This misunderstanding often stems from confusing effort with effectiveness. Effort is subjective. Effectiveness is biological. The body does not measure how hard a workout felt. It measures tension, volume, and recovery. Two sessions that feel equally exhausting can produce vastly different outcomes depending on how that exhaustion was achieved. One may deliver high mechanical tension to muscle fibers, while the other may simply deplete energy stores and overwhelm the nervous system. The pursuit of soreness is another expression of this mistake. Delayed onset muscle soreness is often interpreted as evidence of growth, yet soreness is primarily a sign of unfamiliar stress, not effective hypertrophy. Novel exercises and excessive eccentric loading increase soreness without necessarily increasing growth stimulus. Chasing soreness leads to constant variation, preventing muscles from adapting efficiently. Once soreness fades, individuals often change exercises again, perpetuating a cycle of discomfort without progression. Precision in training does not mean simplicity or ease. It means understanding which variables drive growth and manipulating them intentionally. Progressive overload, for example, provides a clear message to the body that existing capacity is insufficient. This message does not require maximal exhaustion. It requires incremental increases in demand applied consistently. When overload is combined with adequate recovery, the body responds by reinforcing muscle tissue to meet the new challenge. There is also a psychological calm that accompanies precise training. When the goal shifts from surviving workouts to executing them well, attention moves inward toward control, alignment, and awareness. This focus enhances mind-muscle connection, improving fiber recruitment and stimulus quality. Growth then becomes a byproduct of clarity rather than desperation. Culturally, the glorification of exhaustion reflects a broader narrative that values struggle over understanding. In biological systems, however, progress emerges from alignment with underlying mechanisms, not from brute force. Muscles grow when they receive a clear instruction followed by sufficient time and resources to act on it. Exhaustion without clarity is simply noise, and the body responds to noise by becoming efficient at ignoring it. When training becomes about stimulus rather than suffering, progress often resumes quietly. Workouts may feel less dramatic, but performance improves steadily. Muscles respond to the reliability of the signal by increasing size and strength in proportion to the demands placed upon them. The body is not impressed by how hard you try. It responds to how clearly you communicate what you want to become. At the deepest level, the final mistake that quietly halts muscle growth is impatience, a psychological tension that disrupts biological rhythm long before it shows up in the mirror. The human mind is drawn to immediate feedback, to visible confirmation that effort is working. Yet the body operates on timelines shaped by repair cycles, energy availability, and long-term adaptation. When expectations move faster than physiology, behavior subtly shifts in ways that undermine progress, even though the intention is to accelerate it. Impatience alters decision-making. Instead of allowing adaptations to accumulate gradually, individuals begin to chase rapid change through constant adjustment. Programs are abandoned before they can produce results, exercises are swapped too frequently, and recovery is compromised in an attempt to speed the process. Each change resets the adaptive clock. The body, which responds to repeated exposure to a consistent stimulus, never receives enough continuity to justify structural change. Growth stalls not because the stimulus is ineffective, but because it is never sustained long enough to be interpreted as necessary. From a biological standpoint, muscle growth is a conservative investment. The body adds tissue only after confirming that increased capacity is required over time. This confirmation process cannot be rushed. Protein synthesis, satellite cell activity, and connective tissue strengthening unfold gradually. When impatience drives erratic behavior, the body perceives instability. In unstable environments, evolution favors flexibility and efficiency over growth. Muscle tissue is maintained at functional levels, not expanded. Impatience also amplifies stress. Constantly checking progress, comparing results, and questioning the process keeps the nervous system in a state of vigilance. This mental stress translates into physiological signals that elevate cortisol and sympathetic nervous system activity. Even when training and nutrition appear adequate, this background stress skews the internal environment toward caution rather than construction. The body senses urgency as pressure, not opportunity. There is a subtle erosion of trust that occurs when impatience dominates. The individual stops trusting the process and starts micromanaging outcomes. Training becomes reactive rather than deliberate. A missed workout triggers guilt-driven overcompensation. A perceived plateau triggers drastic changes. These reactions introduce noise into the system. The body thrives on clear, repeated signals followed by calm periods of consolidation. Impatience replaces consolidation with constant interference. Time itself is an often misunderstood variable in adaptation. Muscles are not isolated structures. They're integrated into a network of tendons, bones, and neural pathways. As muscle fibers grow, connective tissues must strengthen to support increased force. Neural patterns must adjust to coordinate greater output. These supporting adaptations often progress more slowly than muscle protein synthesis. Impatience ignores these constraints, pushing volume and intensity beyond what the system can integrate. The body responds by slowing growth to protect structural integrity. Psychologically, impatience narrows perception. Small improvements in strength, endurance, or control go unnoticed because they do not match the expected visual change. Yet these subtle improvements are often prerequisites for hypertrophy. Strength gains indicate improved motor unit recruitment and fiber engagement, laying the foundation for later size increases. When these signs are dismissed, the individual may alter training prematurely, interrupting progression from neural adaptation to structural growth. Impatience also distorts a relationship with rest. Rest days begin to feel like lost opportunities rather than essential phases of adaptation. Sleep is compromised by overthinking and anxiety about progress. Recovery, which requires mental calm as much as physical stillness, becomes incomplete. The body repairs damage but does not receive the signal that it is safe to exceed previous limits. Growth remains capped by caution. From a philosophical perspective, impatience reflects a misalignment between human desire and biological reality. Modern culture rewards speed, efficiency, and immediate results, but living systems prioritize sustainability and balance. Muscle growth is not a linear transaction, where effort is exchanged for size. It is a dialogue between stress and safety, demand and support. Impatience interrupts this dialogue by constantly speaking without listening. When patience is restored, behavior changes subtly but powerfully. Training becomes consistent rather than compulsive. Nutrition becomes routine rather than reactive. Recovery is honored without guilt. Over time, these behaviors signal stability. The body relaxes its defensive posture and allows adaptation to accumulate. Growth appears gradually, often noticed only in retrospect, because unfolded without drama. Ultimately, impatience does not stop muscle growth by itself. It triggers a cascade of behaviors that create an environment where growth no longer makes sense biologically. When ambition is tempered with trust in the process, the body responds not with resistance, but with cooperation. Muscle growth then becomes a reflection of alignment between intention and physiology, unfolding at the pace required to be durable rather than rushed.